Welcome, everybody. As people know who've been in these sessions before, this is a pretty sort of relaxed way of us keeping in touch with our clients and friends of Orton and Network, and try to give people a bit of a insight into some of the thinking that we've been coming across. We were approached quite early on in the COVID pandemic by some clients who said, "Look, we're not quite sure how people are going to cope with the next few months. Can we put in place some coaching, some support for leaders?" And we said, "Yep, we're not quite sure how it's going to work because it was new to us." So we've discovered a few things over the last few months, and we'll share with you some insights from that. To what extent, does it differ from face-to-face coaching? And I was quite keen to hear Helen's perspective as a coach. I mean, I've been doing some of this work, but Helen and Leslie have been doing most of the support work. Really, her perspective as a coach. And for those of you who either have been coached or are coaches yourselves, I think it could just be quite useful to hear that. So very practical, pragmatic, non-theoretical kind of stuff. And as Dos said, feel free just to pitch in with any questions as we go along. I put this Dilbert in to the start of the presentation because I thought it was quite relevant. And actually, Dos and I were having a catch up with a client this morning who just said exactly the same sort of scenario as this cartoon suggests. He's working remotely. He has to liaise with offices around the world. He's physically relocated to his in-laws in Delhi, as opposed to being close to the office that organization has outside Delhi, because it's a better working environment. But he works effectively from midday Indian time through to about midnight Indian time, because he has to liaise with different time zones. And at any time, there could be people cooking next door, or the children are running through and got to help with this, got to help with the other, and things get interrupted all the time. And I think at the moment, it's fair to say most colleagues are quite supportive of those interruptions, but it doesn't actually mean that it's necessarily easy for you to cope with working from home. And I know from my own colleagues, and we're having our first face-to-face session tomorrow in the office, we're all getting to the point where it's stretching things quite far now. We're getting a bit stir crazy with it all. So if we're suffering that, we know that other people are as well. In fact, my 2-year-old grandson managed to announce halfway through a meeting last week, as he ran through the kitchen, that he'd done something in his potty, to which all the clients on the Zoom call thought that was very supportive of me to congratulate him. So it's that kind of environment we're working within. I guess we're all facing the same kind of thing. And some of the leadership challenges that people have been talking to us about really quite varied. Balancing being motivational and supporting, whilst actually pushing for performance. So that almost trying to be friendly and engaging people, whilst at the same time reminding everybody that we've got to produce. That's quite a challenge. People having to respond to countless questions when there's very little clarity. So coping with ambiguity as a leader, that's been a theme for some coaching conversations. Maintaining visibility and influence within the organization, when you can't just get up and walk around and nod and look into offices and see people, but also trying to only attend meetings that are relevant for you, and not just accepting everything. That's been a challenge for some people I've been coaching, certainly. Keep the team engaged. That's been a very strong feature across lots of organizations I've been speaking to. Keeping themselves motivated. I know that some of the people Helen's been speaking to have struggled at times with some of these things. And this was one that the final one came out of a conversation I had with a client team, keeping their personal brand sort of featured within the project without appearing to be self-centered. And it was that, look at me, I'm here, I need to be part of this conversation. And doing that remotely was quite a challenge to them. So that was some scenarios, some things that people have been sharing with us. So remote coaching, it is situation specific. It's very person centered. We would go so far as to say it's not a shortcut option. This isn't just something that you do once. In our experience as coaches, it's something that needs to happen over a period of time around themes or developing themes. And it definitely isn't, as those of you who know who coach yourselves, it's not just a casual conversation. Now, does that mean that remote coaching is any different from face-to-face coaching? No, it's just the fact that it's done differently. I think those 4 bullet points would apply, and I can see Helen's nodding, would apply to coaching normally. But the difference with this is we can only see the heads and shoulders. We get limited interaction with people. And in some instances, the timescales that we're working to are much shorter as well. And that makes it more difficult, I think, for the coach, and also more difficult and more challenging for the coachee. So just as general sort of introduction, I just thought it was worth saying it's the constraint that the remoteness puts on you that makes it more difficult. Most people will recognize this model, this structure that coaches work to. There are other models available, but we at Borton tend to use this one as our easy to remember and easy to follow, and sometimes we're quite open with clients that we're using it. Everything starts with people articulating what do they want to achieve, that goal. When do you want to achieve it by? Those kinds of questions that are important. And if you think about the context of a relatively short intervention, a relatively short coaching session, just drilling down into the detail and trying to understand what people are trying to achieve can take quite a bit of time. And in a remote environment, it's not always easy to get down to the real detail. Spending time talking about the reality, what is actually happening now? How do you know? What have you done about it so far? Having detailed conversations absorbs time, and for the coach themselves to be able to tune in to some of the things that aren't being said, and some of the responses and body language that you get when you ask a question can be limited in the remote environment that we've been working in. And discussing and developing options, which most of us know in a coaching session is the bit that can take an inordinate amount of time, because we're exploring things and challenging and promoting things that need consideration. And if we're not careful, if we haven't managed it properly, we end up with a relatively short, action stage, which is the what next or the will element. And again, experienced coaches know that we need to spend that time making sure that if we're going to take action, it's the right action, and people are actually committed to it, to doing that next step. So GROW as a framework, it works in face-to-face. It is also a very useful structure for the remote sessions as well. This is where I wanted to open up and get Helen's input, if it's okay. And Helen hasn't sort of been briefed on this, so I'm hoping that it's sort of been briefed in so much as I said, it'd be useful to have your input, Helen. But I just got a few sort of open type questions that I wondered if Helen would consider, and feel free to pitch in with others if people want to ask as well. So from a coach's perspective, Helen, how challenging has it been for you doing remote coaching?
Well, I think, as you've said already, the role of the coach is exactly the same in terms of bringing the process to the conversation, to the coaching conversation. So making sure that it's not a casual conversation, that it is a structured conversation, and that there's pace to that conversation, and that it's goal orientated, and that there are outcomes that are beneficial for the individual and beneficial for the organisation. No change across, from face-to-face to remote coaching. So for me, where I think the significant challenge comes in when you shift over to remote coaching, which we did at quite short notice, it's around the developing a quality relationship, the quality of that coach-coachee relationship, which actually over time I've come to see is probably a critical success factor for coaching. Okay. So having trust, having empathy, demonstrating that you are really actively listening and hearing, and creating a sense for the coachee that they're in a safe space where they can disclose their concerns, their challenges, their worries, their frustrations. I think for me that's been the biggest challenge in terms of the shift across to remote coaching. And I would hasten to add that, you know, there are many things that we can do and have been doing over the last few months, but I think it's important to recognise that is a significant difference. It's about how you build the empathy and how you sustain and develop a really good working relationship with the coachee.
Because I'm right in saying, and I'm thinking about the organisations we've been working with, that we had limited relationships with one organisation. It was more of a transition from a level within the organisation to then the direct reports. There was a little bit of trust built into the fact that their leaders had been using us, and then it went to the next level. But in one organisation, it was a completely new set of relationships where they hadn't been working with Borton in the past. Was there a noticeable difference in building the relationship, or were they both the same?
I think we probably hit the ground running a little bit faster with the former client, because their line managers had been coachees themselves last year, and they understood what the process was, and they understood the importance of having thought about their development goals, their coaching goals. So the new coachees, if you like, in our second round of working with that organisation, they hit the ground running faster because they'd been briefed and they'd had a conversation, and in some cases they brought their line managers into the first coaching. So we had that three-way conversation right at the outset. With the second example, in my case, a brand new organisation, hadn't met anybody there before, met for the first time over video. Sort of starting from there, just took some sort of extra effort, I guess, as a coach in certain ways, and extra paying attention to things, I think, in a different way to how you would when you're working face to face.
And if my memory serves me right, because I was doing some coaching in that organisation, the second one that you were talking about. I think the exec team was surprised at the extent to which people weren't initially talking about COVID. It was more about general leadership and management, but subsequently, I think as time's gone on, conversations have shifted. How do we move back? How do we get people more engaged? And the COVID topic's been on the agenda a little bit more.
I think that's very true, and I think the coaching work, one of the roles I like to think that I play is to make sure that obviously there's overall set of coaching goals for each coachee, but also that at the start of each coaching session you're really clear on what the goals are for that session, because they change more quickly during something like COVID. So what seems a really big priority at the start of coaching work with somebody, I think they're more likely to say, actually, that's still there, but it's not as big a priority. Now I've got an issue about, how to engage people in this stage of the process, or how to explain X, Y, Z, or how to delegate, or how to bring new people into the organisation, that kind of thing. So I think the goals have changed shape more quickly because of working during lockdown and because of coaching remotely.
And those people, most people on this session know us as consultants who coach rather than coaches who consult. So it's, our focus is always the organizational challenge first and foremost, as opposed to purely an individually centered life coaching kind of environment. That's not what we are, the space that we're in, but it does drift, doesn't it? But I know the conversation you and I had at the start of this, and I think you had to develop your approach a little bit. Is that fair to say? Because you were a bit skeptical as to how valuable this might be.
I think for a change consultant, I have a healthy amount of skepticism about new ways of working. So I had a few concerns, but yes, I think it's been a case of trying some different things and developing an approach that is more nuanced, more suited to the remote ways of working. So, for example, you can read a lot from somebody in a face-to-face coaching session that isn't as evident over video. So if I'm sensing that there's a particular emotion going on, I'm more likely to bring that into the coaching conversation. I might just sort of let a face-to-face session run and see where the conversation goes, but I am more likely to say, that sounds quite stressful, or you seem frustrated about that, or overwhelmed maybe. not to turn it into a counselling session, but just to make sure that I'm not overlooking some of the cues that I would automatically get.
Well, it's interesting because Dave's asked a question on the chat that you've sort of started to answer, but Dave said it's quite easy to underestimate the value of non-verbal cues that are evident in face-to-face and are far harder to pick up on virtual, which is absolutely right. That was has our recent work helped to identify any approaches to help to get over this? So have we found ways of, even though we can't see what would be probably 70% of people, have we found ways of getting over that problem?
I think being open about it and labeling it, and even if you label it inaccurately, it gives the coachee an opportunity to say, no, I don't feel stressed, I feel really angry about it.
Okay. Yeah.
So you get that conversation going, and also revisiting it during the session or at the next session. So don't just pass on to the rest of the conversation and leave that behind, but revisit and check your understanding and check their sort of self-insight and self-awareness. I think has been quite important.
One of the sort of Dave, one of the NLP tools that a lot of people use is eye accessing cues, which is tuning into and noticing how people how their eye movements alter in conversations and in when they're thinking about things or remembering or considering or developing new thoughts around things. And if you tune in more to those than you would normally do in a pure face-to-face, because let's face it, your ability to see the face is stronger on the computer than it probably is if you're sitting there in a room, because you're noticing so many other things. Those cues will give you an indication that people are thinking and going inside their head, as it were, to remember or recall situations, and they'll also give you cues as to whether they've changed their thinking about things. So my response to it, in sort of answering or building on what Helen's been talking about, is you need to become even more aware of what you can see. So the hint is, don't relax, turn up the intensity button on your own acuity as to what you're seeing, and also what you're not seeing and what you're not hearing. And as Helen then said, ask the question maybe earlier than you might have done, because in a face-to-face you might have just let it run. Okay. Final question from me, Helen. Have you got any sort of basic do's and don'ts then?
Probably a few. I think, do remember the process is the process. So if you're using Grow, it works. Stick to the process, stick to the staying goal orientated, but maybe recognize that you need to balance that with flexibility. So there's that. I think also one of the things that remote coaching has opened up an opportunity for is do be flexible and don't be tied to diaries in the same way. And that, obviously, I mean the coachee's diary on the whole, but there have been times where if a coachee's been in back-to-back Zoom and Teams meetings all day, and you sit down with them and they tell you they've just conducted 6 recruitment interviews or whatever it may be, or come out of presenting a paper to the board, it's okay to have a short catch-up meeting there and reschedule a full coaching session for the next couple of days' time, or to, you can play lots of different tunes, and obviously there needs to be discipline and there needs to be momentum. But actually, I do think the remote coaching, a surprise for me has been how it has afforded us the chance to be more flexible around what the coachee needs and what their brain power is up to on a given day, really.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, that we reflected upon this a little while ago, that for some clients, they've actually been able to get more out of the spend that they've been putting into remote coaching than they would have done if we'd been doing face-to-face. And it's been easier to schedule things, rather than Helen arriving at Dave's organization and having to have 4 sessions in the day. You can do a session in the morning and a session the following evening, and so it is working out. But I think this pragmatism and flexibility, I've also noticed at times when people have just had too much in the day, and you've said, look, it just doesn't seem to be the right time, shall we have a catch up, or do you just want to have a chat? and they'll chat and they'll offload about something, and they'll use you as that foil, and then okay, let's go again at a particular time. And I've also thought not to worry too much about cramming it all in, accepting that, you know, we always know that there is another session coming, and they know that. I think when we do face-to-face, it's often, well, it's going to be another month and a half before I see you, so we must finish off with something that you're going to do in the next month and a half. And I don't think that necessarily applies in a virtual environment. So brilliant, Helen. I'm sure other people will have questions for you. Dave's put his thumb up, so we must have answered something for him, so that's useful. Coachee's perspective, here's just some quotes that came through recently. 3 of them are, no, actually all 4 have been coached. The top right-hand corner is a chief exec, the bottom right-hand corner is chief exec. But they're all saying, you know, in some ways it's surprised them, the extent to which remote coaching was valuable. I think it's interesting that people say, you know, other people have noticed the impact that it's had on me, and chief exec saying, you know, it's really helped to build a strong, cohesive leadership team, which wasn't the purpose of the coaching. It was actually individual coaching, but because they were talking about similar things, you can then play the broader organizational coach role and say, well, why don't you talk to your colleague about that? You know, let's have a proper conversation. Let's not avoid this. So that just gives an insight into what some people that we've been working with have been saying. So if you're going to take this forward, sort of what might your next steps be? You've got to consider if you're the person who's thinking about coaching for yourself, and I'm sure many of you will be, you know, what are your real needs currently? You know, this is about relatively short-term challenges as opposed to the longer-term development coaching conversations that we might have. So consider your needs or your team's current needs, and how well are you or they coping with themselves, you know, the other colleagues, you, the current situation. So what's the framework? What's the need? What's the reason for doing something? Do they need support? And do you need support? And do they need challenge? Or in many instances, do they need a combination of the two? It's very difficult to challenge somebody if you haven't first supported them, because they tend not to accept the challenge. And are they open? Are you open to being coached? In both instances of organizations we started coaching recently, there were some people who were quite skeptical, and as you see from the quotes, you know, that their mind has changed. But I often say, you know, fundamentally, if somebody isn't open to it, then remote or face-to-face isn't going to help. You're just going to meet resistance pretty much all the way through. And how will you or how will they know it's been useful or successful? You know, what change do we expect to see? Therefore, how will we judge success? And success in coaching is often measured on perception and feeling, as opposed to return on investment. But you can look at that. You can look at, you know, time, utilization, impact. But generally speaking, we're talking in this kind of coaching about people's perceptions and people's feelings. And measuring success in that way. So, does it make sense? Absolutely. Yeah, it's situation specific. It's bespoke. It always is. It's person-centered. It's a combination of support and challenge. It's not a shortcut option. It is a program over time, and it's not a casual conversation. It is guided with an intention of an outcome. So, does it make sense? Yes, we would say so. Ironically, in the current circumstances, it can probably make more sense than face-to-face. So I'd encourage you all to do more of it with your colleagues, and if you need help and support, happily talk to us about setting up a program, you know, that you can run, or a program that we can help with. We'd be more than happy to do that. Next session, which is in a fortnight's time, we're going to share with you some insights into running improvement events. We've been learning over the last few weeks and months how to do standard process improvement event activity, but doing it remotely. So we're going to share some things with people. So we're going to open that one up. So Dos, do you want to coordinate any questions if anybody's got anything?
Yeah, there isn't any question in the comments box, but I've got a question for one of you or both of you. So we normally talk about when we talk about coaching, we always talk about the safe space. Have you, from your recent experience, have you noticed the perception of safe space to be varying between face-to-face and the remote coaching? Is people perceiving it slightly differently, or is there a bit of a danger someone mistook safe space to remote coaching against face-to-face?
I think from my perspective, most of the people I've been coaching have been existing relationships that have moved on to a remote platform. Therefore, the safe space has been already established in the relationship. And as the relationship has developed more in the remote environment, people have gone deeper or opened up more about their concerns or challenges. Helen, you've probably done more where the work's been in new relationships. Have you found this a bit challenging, the safe space?
I actually think that in some ways people open up more because they're sitting in their kitchen while they're talking to you, or in their home office, or wherever they're working from home. And I've sort of borrowed a phrase from somewhere and talked to people about what's it like living at work, not working from home. And because they're living at work, working from home, I have found people actually might disclose more readily than they would if they're sitting in one of those kind of offices where everyone's going past and looking through the open plan environment. It's not true of everybody, but I think that there's a significant number of people I can think of that seem to have been very ready to disclose, and that's possibly also because they've really needed somebody who's just there to listen to them at the moment.
Okay, that's good. Thank you for that, Helen and Mike. There's one question from Ken. Is remote coaching a replacement for face-to-face? Can a blend work when face-to-face is safe enough?
Yeah. Yes. Is it a replacement? It can be if the circumstances force it. Yes, I think we've proved that. And if you talk to any of the coachees, they would say so. Personally, I still prefer the face-to-face. I just feel that you can get deeper and more done. But that might be my interpretation as a coach rather than a coachee. But I'm older and probably more stuck in my ways than. But I have been surprised how well it's been going.
Can I just quickly add that I think, digressing a little bit into the world of climate change, I think we might find clients who are trying to make sure their practices are as eco-friendly as possible. They might prefer the remote offering on those grounds, but that's looking into the future, perhaps. I think it will be a consideration for clients.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So
brilliant.
Looks like there aren't much questions, and we are bang on time. So thank you, everyone, and looking forward to see you in a couple of weeks' time on running improvement events. Especially, we are going to cover some remote way of running improvement events in that session as well. So thank you, Mike. Thank you, Helen, for your time, and thank you, everybody.
Thank
you. See you in 2 weeks' time.
Good to see people I haven't seen for a while. Nice to see you, Dave.
Yeah, nice to see you all.
See you.